One of the questions we have to ask from the very beginning is when we talk about Islam in the contemporary world is, as Muslims address modernity, the problems of the contemporary world, the problems of diversity, the problems that are brought about by the global warming, the problems that are brought about by the technology and information revolutions, does there always have to be an Islamic answer to the question? In other words, if you're a feminist and you're a Muslim, do you have to be solely an Islamic feminist, or do you have access as well to Kristeva, Simone de Beauvoir, the larger realm of feminism that's not Islamic? And the same with issues of politics. You know, it's a big, one thing we're going to talk about today that I think is important. One of the big issues that's out there is the relationship between Islam and democracy. So are we talking about Islam and democracy, or Muslims in democracies, or are we talking about Islamic democracy? And there seems to be, this seems to be one of the real issues that's there. We'll talk about feminism a little bit later, but my favorite feminist scholar of Islam right now is a woman from University of Cape Town in South Africa named Sadia Sheikh, who's written an absolutely brilliant book on gender in the thought of Ibn Arabi. Marvelous book, and my students are in love with this book. She's also a very charismatic speaker if you bring her up on YouTube, the things that she speaks about. What I like about her work so much is that she really thoroughly knows the Muslim sources, and she's immersed in the writing of Ibn Arabi and in the historical sources of the period she's working on, but she's also absolutely fluent in theory and method in women and gender studies, and brings those things together in ways that don't do violence, to the Muslim sources, but instead allow her to see things that she might not otherwise have seen. And so I guess what I want to say to start off is that the problems of Muslims in the contemporary world are for the most part the same problems that are the problems of Christians in the contemporary world, and secular people in the contemporary world, and Jews in the contemporary world. And I think we make a mistake if we become, in a sense, Orientalist about this and think that Muslims are somehow human in a different way than other human beings. So I want to just put that on the table, and I think you'll see why as I proceed here. Because I do think there's a tendency, for example, when students study the history of the Middle East, a sort of meaningless term, right? The middle of where and east of what? You know, it's a political term, it's a construction. To think that Islam explains everything. And it doesn't. It's not an explanatory term. It's something you need to understand because it's something that's really important as one of the aspects of identity of the people who live in those parts of the world. But knowing that somebody's a Muslim does not necessarily tell you what their position is going to be on any particular political or social issue. All right. Now, there are those who would argue that there's a crisis of Islam in the 21st century. I really get tired of people who say, what Islam needs is a reformation. Where is the Muslim Martin Luther? First off, those people forget that the Reformation was not exactly a pleasant experience for Europe. It resulted in 100 years, they call it the 100 Years' War for a reason, of pitched battle and corpses piled up all over the place. Some people will try to say, but the Reformation led to modernity. Realize how insulting that is to Catholics, right? When we think about when we think about the Renaissance, right? The Renaissance is taking place, for the most part, in Catholic Europe. And yet somehow, I know so many people who think that Luther is responsible for the beginning of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, which is just bizarre. So I'm disturbed by that, the notion that there, and if we were to look for analogs of the Reformation in contemporary Islam, I think where we see them is in fact among certain Muslim groups that those same people will be very critical of. If the Reformation was about Protestants saying, let's get rid of the 1,300 years of Christian history and thought and go back to the original sources and find out what the first generation was about and try to follow the first generation of Christians as closely as we can, that's Salafism. And as a non-Salafi, I'm not really comfortable with saying that what Islam needs is a reformation. Okay? And again, that also puts forward the idea that, that there's something wrong with Islam. That the fact that Muslims are dealing with problems that are political problems and social problems and stuff means that there is something wrong with Islam. Do we say that? I mean, there are people now who say that, well, the problem with Europe was Christianity, and we needed the Enlightenment to get past that. But, they were wrong about that too, I think. It's not that there's something wrong, because Islam is a process. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe in God. I believe in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I believe that, in the mind of God and the Prophet, there may be a transcendent Islam that's there, but we as human beings don't have access to it. We have to, that's why the word jihad is so important. Dr. Shafi was talking about jihad. We have to struggle every day to figure out what Islam is. One of my favorite scholars of all time is a woman who's now passed named Marilyn Waldman, who used to teach at Ohio State University. She, like me, does not like the word fundamentalism, because it's a Christian Protestant term that you stick on to Islam and it covers more than it reveals. But she liked to talk about what she called the piety of, oh dear, I wasn't going to say this, so it's lost my mind. The piety of determinacy and the piety of indeterminacy. Most pre-modern people, and a lot of people in the modern world, practice what is called the piety of indeterminacy. Meaning, the problem for religious people is to try to understand and comprehend the will of God, because God is so transcendent and so beyond mere human understanding that every day is the struggle to come to grips with what it is to be a human being in relationship with the immensity of the divine. The piety of determinacy is the kind of religiosity that says any reasonable person looking at the text can tell absolutely what God's will is. Let's take it away from Islam so it doesn't cut so close to home. The people who go through the Bible and proof text and say, you say these words, you say that, that's how you're saved. If you don't do that, then this. It's clear, this is wrong, that's right, we can make the list. And now, since everybody knows what the truth is, our problem as Christians is to get everybody to agree with this and to do what we say. Worse, since it's rooted in a concept of rationality, that any reasonable person looking at the text can tell what the clear meaning of the text is, people who disagree with that interpretation aren't only wrong, they're irrational. And we should ignore them, or worse. I see that right now, Islam is in a kind of struggle between those people who are engaged in the piety of indeterminacy, who see the problem of Islam is that Muslims have to every day figure out what is the right thing to do, and those people who are so absolutely convinced that they know that they want to enforce that on every other Muslim and pass judgment on every other Muslim. If you were to ask me what I think within Islam, what the biggest problem is, it's Takfeer. For those of you who are not Muslim, Takfeer means calling somebody else a kafir or a non-believer. You find this a lot among 17 and 18-year-old men who tell people in their 50s and 60s who spent their life studying Islam, you are wrong. You cannot say that it is possible that we could read Islam in a way to say that women can lead prayer, because I read this pamphlet by Maulana Maududi and he says this, and that is the truth. My teacher, Aziz Sachedina, one of the most brilliant scholars of Islam I know, I remember him, talking to me about all these young men who would come forward and explain to him how he was wrong in his understandings of Islam. A man who spent his life meticulously looking at the sources, trying to come to grips with how to deal with the issues of Islam in the contemporary world.